Welcome to Catholic Ed for All, your weekly insight into topics of special education in Catholic schools. My name is Dr. Raul Escarpio, and I invite you to join me each week as we learn how to be more inclusive in Catholic schools and continue to live out St. John Paul II's message of open wide the doors to Christ. Many thanks go out to RCL Benziger, who is generously sponsoring this podcast. RCL Benziger enriches the worldwide Catholic community by providing the most engaging and highest quality resources, programs, and services rooted in the rich and diverse tradition of the Catholic faith. And now, on to our show. Today, I am joined by Sedonna Prater, Director of Curriculum and Instruction for the Diocese of Knoxville, Tennessee. Hello, Sedonna. Welcome to the show and thanks for being here.
Hello, Raul. Thank you for having me. This is a pleasure.
Oh, it's my pleasure as well. Thank you. Sedonna, can you please tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Currently, I'm the Director of Curriculum and Instruction for the Diocese of Knoxville Catholic Schools, and that's in East Tennessee. We're a very small diocese. We have 10 Catholic schools spread out all over East Tennessee. I came into this position after having been a principal and an assistant principal and a teacher. I've been in Catholic school education about 21 years, and prior to that, I was in public school education. I've had a variety of experiences as a teacher, from teaching English in high school to literacy to teaching English in Japan, and all of those have helped me in the current role that I am in. Basically, my job is to do whatever our superintendent needs me to do. There are two of us in our central office, and so a superintendent, and then in my role, we kind of just do everything. We have one administrative assistant for our Catholic schools.
So, I always try to remember to ask my former teachers what they taught before they moved on to administration.
Sure. I started, it, I think as I mentioned a minute ago, my first teaching experience was actually overseas in Japan, and
Wow.
I started as a ESL teacher. At that time, I wasn't quite 100% sold that I wanted to be a teacher in the United States. I wanted to teach English as a second language, but I so fell in love with teaching that I came back and became a high school secondary English teacher. Because I knew some Spanish and some Japanese, I was placed as a foreign language teacher, so I did that for a while. My certification being in English also gave me certification in literacy and reading, and so I served as a Chapter 1 reading teacher for a short period of time. And then when I moved into the Catholic school system, there were in our area there were not positions available in the high school, so I taught 8th grade English and American history and Spanish, and then I became an assistant principal, and so that's pretty much it. I did do one other stint working in a men's maximum security correctional unit to teach
Nice.
literacy.
Very
hmm
nice. Yes. So that's a full life right there, Sedonna. You've been all around, haven't you?
I've been in education quite a while, but I joke about it. I feel old on one hand, but not really, because there's so many things to learn and do. So it's always exciting to be in education.
Absolutely, absolutely. So you touched briefly about your office in the Diocese of Knoxville. So what does the Director of Curriculum and Instruction do there on a daily basis?
Mainly, as I said, support the superintendent, but I work very closely with the principals and the teachers. We work on the curriculum decisions, the curriculum development, the design, and implementation. I, the best term I like to call myself is the director of the CIA, and I usually get a laugh on that because it's curriculum instruction and assessment. So
Yes.
anything related to those, professional development and implementation in those areas is so I work, with textbook vendors a great deal, and hands-on, helping teachers with special needs or issues in the classroom.
Excellent, excellent. So what I really brought you on is to talk about second language learners. So I know that that's your background. I know that's what you're doing for your dissertation right now. So let's start easy. What makes a student a second language learner?
Um, a student that is has another language other than English as a first language is an English language learner, and that could be a student who, in the home, there is another language spoken, or their first initial language was something other than English, or who is an immigrant. But typically, even if the language that they predominantly use is English, but there is another language that they have learned or that is in use in their home area, then they're categorized as English language learner. Now, really, to determine the proficiency or the level would require a little bit more into it, but just that term in general is very expansive for anyone that has a different cultural or linguistic background, a diversity.
So when a child enters a Catholic school, I know that when they enter a public school, they give them what's called a home language survey. I believe that's the phrase that they ask what
That's correct.
languages are spoken at home, the majority, blah blah, to determine uh, second language in this, their level, if they're a second language at all, student at all. What is done for a Catholic school? Is something similar done?
I would hope so. I would hope that all Catholic schools have, as a part of their admission process, some sort of home language survey, because what we know about English language learners, these students speak more than 400 different languages, and what we know from the research is very, very important to know what their linguistic background has been and what their level of knowledge has been. So I would hope that most Catholic schools have implemented either on their admissions form or after they've admitted some sort of home language survey. And there are so many out there because, as you said, all of the public schools, it's a requirement that they administer that and survey the students. So there's a wealth of examples that Catholic schools can draw on if they're not doing that. But that's usually the first step in identification of an English language learner, is finding out as much as possible about their home language and what their educational background and family experience has been with regard to language and culture.
Excellent. So when we're looking at the classroom, before we even touch the curriculum part of it, what should a Catholic classroom look like for second language learners? What are some things that you as an administrator in Knoxville would walk in and expect to see in that classroom?
I think I think in Catholic schools, whether it's for an English language learner or any student, I think that I would hope to see a very culturally inclusive classroom. Because we're Catholic schools, I would want to see, images of saints from a variety of different cultures and different backgrounds, and
Beautiful.
I would like to see a wealth of literature, in different languages and about different cultures and all of those things around. The biggest thing I think that, as I said, our English language learners come from a variety of different language backgrounds with over 400. Probably number one, the highest is Spanish. The second highest is probably Vietnamese. And so, there are so many materials that we can find for our Spanish speaking. We can have literature, that sort of thing there. Um, really those schools, those Catholic schools that I would say are just doing amazing. They're, trying to translate things, and I would see that on their websites, and I would see that in their literature and at their school, that um, really shows that they're trying to be bilingual and inclusive and welcoming of different diversities from linguistic and cultural backgrounds.
Excellent. All points taken. I love the fact of the cultural saints, saints from
Hmm.
different parts of the country. It's fantastic. So, are you a fan of word, not word walls? I'm sure you're a fan of word walls, but labeling the classroom to assist English language learners. And the second part of that question is, are you more of a proponent of speaking in English to the child or in their home language if possible?
Well, those are good questions, Raul, and probably a lot of misconceptions are associated with those too. But what we know from the research is we know that students are going to learn another language easier and more effectively, more fluently, if they're already proficient in their primary language. And the research is clearly pointing to the link between being very fluent and competent in their first language. And students that know more than one language are truly gifted students. And so we don't want to take anything away from that. We want to support and embrace and nurture their first language and their first culture. So I'm not a proponent of that they just must learn English. They must learn English because actually that's almost counterproductive. And I think one of the things that holds us up is when students are really becoming bilingual and they're learning too, it may appear to the teacher and it may appear to people that are not as aware of language acquisition and the years that it takes that they're not progressing as fast as others. But I'll give you this example. Think about this. If you were to assess a young student with a picture assessment, a diagnostic assessment, and you did it in English, and this was a bilingual student, that maybe this student was growing up with English and Spanish in the home, and you assess them in the English, and they maybe knew half the vocabulary words that their native English speaker would know. But then if you took that and you also assessed them in Spanish and they also knew half of those words, really what they're showing is that their linguistic aptitude is double their
Hmm.
non-native partner. And so sometimes we forget that. We forget that that really it may take a little longer, it may appear on the surface that with them being bilingual that it's taking a little bit longer, but they'll really be far more advanced in the end and have a greater repertoire of linguistic abilities. So the program, ideally, the best program for English language learners would be a truly bilingual program where there is language, where they're being taught in both languages. That is not easy to do. That's not easy to do in the public sector, much less the Catholic school, where we may not have the resources or personnel to do that. So if that is not a possibility, the next best thing is to really have a culturally sustaining, inclusive environment where the teacher tries to learn as much about their language, uses that knowledge in their instructional strategies, uses other knowledge to support and reinforce them as they acquire their English skills. But do not take away from that home language. Let them continue to grow and learn in that as well.
So what you're saying is it would be beneficial to try to have a dual language school or a dual language
It
program in the
it
school.
it would really be ideal if we were talking about the perfect place for the English, that would be the ideal.
All right.
But if
So,
you couldn't do that, which most of us can't, there are many things that we can do to that where they will excel and do extremely well.
okay, so let's jump into another misconception. One of the misconceptions um, is between second language learners and those that have disabilities. And one of the biggest problems, Sedona, that I run into um, is that the amount of time that we should try to wait to see if it's a language issue or if there's an exceptionality issue, if the child
Right.
has special needs. In your professional opinion, which school do you subscribe to? Do you subscribe to the school that says, well, they're what we call language learner, I'm sorry, they're a language learner that does not have any experience with English. We need to wait X amount of time before we even look at an evaluation piece for them to see if they have exceptional needs? Or are you subscribed to the school that says, yeah, within X amount of time, I'm going to know immediately if they have any special needs, so we need to evaluate. So are you a proponent of waiting a long time to evaluate, or are you a proponent of, no, I think I know my students and they need to be evaluated? What do you say?
Well, I think it's who is saying, I know my students. If it's someone that is very versed, or if it's a school psychologist that's very versed in language acquisition and bilingual education, then I would say I would agree with that. But generally, I probably would not. And I understand both sides of the argument, but when we think about that, the current evidence suggests that it typically requires 3 to 5 years to achieve advanced proficiency, and for some students, it's as great as 7 to 10. We really have to look individually at the student, and we have to begin, I would say, kind of going through an elimination process before we ruled in that we needed to test the students. What we also know in our research is that it goes both ways. Currently, we have many students that have been over-identified and that they are English language learners, but they've been over-identified into special education. They've been identified too early. And then we have some that they should have been identified earlier and they were not. So when I say that we need to look at kind of begin going through a process of elimination, there are certainly some similarities between LD, or learning disabilities, and language acquisition. Some of these you can begin ruling out. Is it an LD, or is it truly from language acquisition? By just getting some information. Maybe from the parents, like, for example, difficulty following directions is something that is a behavior associated with learning disability sometimes. That's also a behavior that's very often attributed to English language learners, but in that respect, it's probably because they can't understand it. Unless you find out from, for example, the parents, and you also find out that when the mother is speaking to the child in Spanish and they have difficulty following directions, they show that same difficulty in their home language. That would be kind of a red flag to me. That would be something that I would begin wanting to investigate a little bit further. So there are a number of things that you begin collecting as much data on the student, learning out from the home, what they're doing in the home, either through discussions with the parents. The problem with assessment with English language learners, and this is something that is, a concern. If you have to assume that they have enough language to be assessed, or you have to know that they have enough language ability to be assessed on that assessment, that it's going to be valid. If you bring in interpreters or something like that to translate the assessment, there's always a danger that the test will not be valid at that point. So again, if you do end up going down the route of assessing, it's very important that the assessor really understands language acquisition, bilingual education, and is using an instrument that is going to be fair and equitable to that student,
And
so
you,
that there will not be bias.
I'm sorry, and you answered my question, because I could say, well, we can just test in the home language, and that will decide whether there's an exceptionality based on the student and not the language. But you're right. You're right. With the interpreter, or even with the test and how the test is given, we need to make sure that it is reliable and valid for the student.
And there are some assessments that And again, but you have to know too, is that student fluent in that in the home language to even be assessed in that. So
Excellent.
that's where there's information that you really have to know. I think when you're looking at interventions or trying to support an English language learner, I really believe in the team approach. And I believe that, even from the beginning, especially if you're beginning to suspect, for example, the student doesn't seem to be, if you have other English language learners in your classroom and you're doing the same sort of strategies and different things with all of them, but this one particular student doesn't seem to be progressing as the other English language learners in the classroom, that would be another kind of little red flag that's like, maybe something is going on. And at that point, I really would have a support team, to kind of troubleshoot, problem solve, look at all of the data, and decide on interventions, and including the special needs teacher, the special needs expert. I would have them in there.
Such valuable and timely information, Sedonna. I'm going to have you back so we can just talk curriculum and what they should look like.
Okay.
So before I finish, before we close, I'd like to ask you, what should Catholic special education for English language learners look like?
Well, I think first of all, it needs to be inclusive. Catholic education for English language learners needs to be inclusive. We need to help our teachers. Most of our teachers come to us with very little training in English language learners and strategies for English language learners, and a lot of it is, once they get the training, it's a no-brainer. It's like, oh wow, I can do that. Or I didn't realize that would help, or that didn't occur to me to do that. But helping them get training in language acquisition and proficiency in the different levels, and then scaffolding and strategies, sheltered instruction, comprehensive input, those sort of things that will help them develop strategies in their classroom. But I'm going to just reiterate, the biggest thing is to be open, welcoming, get the professional development that will help you serve them, and have them in the mainstream classroom with your other students, with the sheltered support and sheltered strategies.
Amen. Amen. Sedonna, I have really enjoyed and learned from our podcast today, and I want to thank you for joining me. I wish you nothing but prayers and blessings as you continue your mission as the director of the CIA, and as you continue to hopefully finish that dissertation real soon. I wish you nothing but prayers and blessings, and I thank you for being on the show.
Well, thank you, Raul. It was a pleasure.
Well, that's it for this week. If this podcast was a blessing to you, can you please head over to iTunes and subscribe and give us a review or a rating? It really does help other Catholic educators find the podcast and use it as a resource. Thanks again to the amazing people at RCL Benziger for generously sponsoring this podcast. Check out their new resource for Catholic schools, Blessed Are We, Faith in Action, which enables teachers to share the love of Christ with children who have special needs. Visit rclbenziger.com to learn more. Join me again next time as we continue to advance God's kingdom by including all of God's children in Catholic schools and faith formation. Until then, this is Dr. Raul Escarpio. Thanks for listening, and may God bless your day.